continue to contest each other on trade, tariffs, and now even defense. With me now to discuss, Emily Jasinski, commentary writer at the Washington Examiner, and Tori Whiting, a trade economist at the Heritage Foundation. Emily, let me start with you first. Of course, last week, the big talk, the U.S. naval ship that was sort of chased away, if you will, in the South China Sea, another very belligerent and bold move on behalf of China. So we are battling on multiple fronts. The second largest economy in a country that's spending a lot of money on a military designed to stand up to America. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think you just said the key phrase there, which is multiple fronts. We think about our long-term struggle with China really in terms of trade. I mean, it's not just trade, it's intellectual property, it's defense, it's all of these different facets. And while we have our attention completely diverted to the craziness that's happening here in Washington, this is probably one of the biggest things that's happening that people are not paying enough attention to. And so we saw a lot of moves. We saw Mike Pence's speech last week, which people are saying is probably going to go down as something that really was a big moment, especially in the trade war with China and in our relationship with China. And so I think what we're seeing is China getting a little bit more nervous. Their responses, yesterday, what they did in their banking system, maybe inject a little bit more cash flow in it. I think we're starting to see that the long-term picture looks better for the United States. I think we're starting to see China take some steps that make it look a little bit nervous, but this is a huge story.
You know, Tori, of course, China's markets were closed for Golden Week, so it was closed all week, but they did open yesterday. Shenzhen and Shanghai both down almost 4%. Emily just mentioned the People's Bank of China lowering their rate, forcing government commercial banks are trying to induce them into lending up to $175 billion. More risky loans, of course, in a country that has its own debt issues. On an economic front, I know everyone says China can hold out indefinitely, but can they?
Well, I mean, here's the real thing. There are lots of issues happening right now between the United States and China, as the other guest, of course, mentioned. But these issues are separate, and they should be treated separately. On the trade front, what we're seeing is the United States taking this approach of increasing tariffs here in the United States on the American people to try and get China to change on its economic policy while also dealing with the foreign policy issues as well. What we really need to be dealing with is having these two issues could be as separate as possible and to have an approach at our trade issues with China that really focus on the real problems, which, as the administration has mentioned, are in things like the theft of intellectual property.
Well, let me ask you, Tori, can you ideally separate them, or when it comes to negotiating on both sides, do they both get conflated? Or, it's kind of hard to say, hey, we'll negotiate this tension and ignore this other tension, the military tension just as much as trade tension, and then the wild card, China's role with North Korea.
Well, I don't think we need to be ignoring the tensions. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I'm saying is that we need to be looking at those tensions and those pressure points and really getting at the root of the problem. Until now, or really for the last 9 months or so, the two sides have been throwing tariffs back and forth at each other and haven't really been getting at the real economic issues that either side sees, specifically what the United States sees as unfair trade practices happening in China. Tariffs or taxes on the American people clearly are not going to make China change its behavior. They haven't for over 9 months now, and we need to be focusing on what I like to call these scalpel approaches to really fixing the problem.
Yeah, Emily, I tend to disagree with Tori. I don't know that 9 months is enough after 3 decades of plundering to say let's throw in the towel. We know general statescraft did not work under Republicans and Democrats, and we just came off last week of a new NAFTA deal that a lot of experts said wasn't possible, wasn't going to happen. So I'm not sure how long we should give it, but I'm not sure 9 months is enough. And I think China is under a lot more pressure than we are.
Yes, and I like that you mentioned the NAFTA deal, because in terms of our ability to potentially isolate China, that's big news. A looming trade deal with the EU could possibly play into that as well. And so I think in terms of the pivot, which 9 months ago, we'll say that was the pivot, I still agree with you. I think that's a relatively short period of time in this decades-long struggle with China. I think the long-term prospects for the United States are looking better, though of course there's always reason to be skeptical. It's so hard to predict these things. But yeah, I'm with you on this one, Charles.
All right, let's just hope Jack Ma isn't right and it takes 20 years to resolve all of this. Ladies, thank you both very much. Appreciate it. Coming up, how the midterm elections will impact your money.